now. I want to say thank you for the introduction I was given. It was very generous. I usually don't comment on introductions. It's kind of bad form, but it actually wasn't quite generous enough. I have 8 children, not 6 children, so I got that out. Forgive me if I didn't mention that. So, but it is great to see such a great crowd here. I was able to speak to some of you in the reception, and you were very polite when I informed you that you would be hearing from me and not from Dr. Arnn. I appreciate that. I do know that Dr. Arnn was very disappointed to not be able to come here tonight himself. He is, of course, one of the busiest men in America, and you know, given how much the college is growing and given how much it is prospering and everything that's going on, it's just you know, it's a lot to handle, and it's also, in a way, very much the opposite of the direction of most of higher education these days. And so I feel very honored that he asked me to step in, and it was also easy to do because I was able to drive here. Usually when he asks me to do it, I have to get an airplane. So I'm going to say something about what makes the education at the college unique, and I'm going to do that in a way that also kind of brings in some national issues that are front and center these days. I've been asked to speak to the status of constitutional government in our time, which is it's not really a topic if you have a weak stomach, but you know, times are tough. So I will talk about this in the context of contemporary affairs, of course, but also want to bring in the perspective of American history and talk especially about the original principles of our founding, of our Constitution. And this, I think, is one of the main things, to my mind, that makes the college so unique and so important in our public discourse today, right? Because you can find plenty of commentary about, you know, the current goings-on in politics, probably more than you want to hear all the time. But so much has been forgotten, it seems to me, or really, I suppose you might say, never learned in the first place, about the miracle and about the success of the American Constitution, about the founding of the Constitution, about the principles of the Constitution. And so our idea at the college is we really aim to do some good in our public discourse by reminding our fellow citizens what those principles are and really seeking to restore them to their rightful place in the public mind, in the public consciousness. And we think Hillsdale College is in a unique position to do this. And that's because we're a little different. A lot of the reasons you just heard about in the video. But one of the things we do that's very different, we spend a lot of time talking about old things at the college. Things that certainly aren't taught so much at other places in higher education. So we have a very extensive core curriculum, regardless of what particular major or topic you decide eventually to study if you come as a student. We have core courses in American history. We have core courses in economics, a knowledge of which both history and economics appears to be increasingly lacking today, especially among young people. We're just about the only college in the country to require every student who comes through our doors to take an entire course dedicated to the study of the United States Constitution. It's been my privilege to teach that many, many times. We teach its history, its structure, we teach the basic principles and the kind of political philosophy that gave rise to the Constitution. These are principles that have allowed, after all, so many of us to prosper, to lead such free and happy lives, especially in comparison with other nations. And it is really, I think, astonishing to think about how these things today are so often just simply taken for granted, how quickly and easily they can be lost if we continue to take them for granted. So the need for basic literacy in our civics, in our economics, in our history, in our political principles, I think is obvious even from a casual observation of how we speak, how we have a national discourse today. As evidence of that, I thought I would start by focusing on or drawing your attention to a saying or an expression that seems to be so familiar in our discourse today. You hear it all the time from our political class, our media elites, that I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with it. And that is the constant references we hear today to our democracy. Our democracy, just put your hand over your heart, our democracy. And especially the threats to our democracy, right? We're constantly hearing about all of the threats that are out there. These threats tend to be anything that oppose the policies or the agenda of the progressive left. And if you may recall, in fact, that our president gave a speech last year, got a lot of attention, in which he argued that about half of the voters in the country are a threat to democracy. He may even have been talking about some number of people in this room. I don't know. But the point was to make it clear that these people we don't just disagree about policy, right? We don't have different ideas about specific things, but that these people are actually threats to our very system of democratic government, right? It was really an extraordinary speech for a president to give. It's a declaration that a very substantial number of citizens in your country are enemies of the state. That was the clear point. It's a very powerful rhetorical strategy too, if you think about it, right? You take this thing that we all cherish, that we're taught is our common heritage as citizens of this country, and you paint those who oppose your policies as enemies of that thing. And so this strategy involves a lot of talk about democracy. It involves a lot of talk about democracy without ever saying really what we mean by that. Right? What does it mean to have democracy? And at the college, it turns out, one of the unique things about our education is that it involves a deep and serious study of what democracy actually means. The founders of the college, going way back to the Articles of Incorporation when the college was founded in the 1840s, they knew that an education in the fundamentals of democracy was essential. That without that, we'd eventually lose our civic liberty and our economic liberty. And so that fundamental goal, what they understood to be a fundamental goal of higher education, is actually right there in our mission statement, in our Articles of Incorporation. It's been there from the very beginning. And certainly, the founders of the college were quite correct and quite proper to place this mission at the center of the college's activities. Because when you reflect on the actual meaning of democracy, what its history has been, how it's actually embodied in our Constitution, you learn, of course, that it means almost exactly the opposite of what we're told it means today. It means almost exactly the opposite of the way that it's used by our political and our media class. And our students at the college are in a unique position to understand why this is so. Now, you might wonder why it takes some kind of unique education, a college education to boot, right? High-level education, to know what it means to have a democracy. I mean, this is not a complicated concept, right? Most of us, I think, learned it at an early age. We learned it from our parents. We learned it perhaps in grade school. You know, we're privileged to live in a free country. We're privileged to live in a democratic country. Not a perfect country, to be sure, but certainly not the unjust, hateful, oppressive country that so many of our students today are in schools taught that they should hate and be ashamed of. Right? So when we learn these lessons, what did we learn exactly? What does it mean to live in a democratic country? And I think it's been it's kind of been an interesting time to reflect on that question. I've been sort of fascinated in a bizarre way with the changeover in the British monarchy that we've seen, in the media, and the death of the long-standing British monarch and a new monarch take the throne, and then you've got the royal family and all of that. And Britain's monarchy, obviously, we know is pretty much for show these days. But it actually is kind of a good occasion to think about, well, this is kind of interesting. This is a different form of government that they have, right? And it wasn't always for show. Right? And what are its principles, and how is it different than how we chose to found our regime? So, in a monarchy, the power to rule, which is to say the power to make laws, the power of the sword, the power of the purse, these things belong to a single person, and that person is not elected. That person does not possess that power because his subjects have agreed that he should have it. He possesses it instead by virtue of some other principle, heredity, divine appointment, whatever the case may be. And therefore, the people in that regime are not equals. They're not considered equals. One person is born with an inherent right to rule them without their consent, right? Whether they agree or not. Right? Perpetual subjectship, that's the concept. And we know there are various versions of this kind of rule. We see it in dictatorships. We see it in countries where one's wealth kind of amounts to a right to rule. And of course, some combination of these things formed the old feudal system in Europe, from which our first Americans fled in order to form a different kind of political order. And so the basic American understanding of democracy, which is stated right at the outset of our Declaration of Independence from the British monarch, it turns out, is that we're all equal in our rights. That's the core principle. We're equal in our rights. Now, this doesn't mean that we're equal in all kinds of other ways. Obviously, look around the room. We all look different. We all have different talents. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. We're all unequal in many, many ways. But it simply means that God, when he created us, didn't naturally give, in giving us all these different qualities, he didn't naturally give to some people the inherent right to rule others. And that basic principle of the Declaration, which is adopted in the Constitution, no man may govern another without the other's consent, has been core to our political self-understanding. This is why the founding generation understood, contrary to what is often taught in schools today, that slavery had to be eradicated. Right? They knew that. They didn't know how to do it at the time, but they certainly knew that it was a contradiction with the core principle on which the country was founded. So democracy means, therefore, that the authority for ruling comes from the people themselves. So laws aren't made unless they agree to it. And in our system, we have a representative democracy, so we have elected representatives. They have to agree to it. Laws aren't made because the lawmaker has special wisdom, as you might have in an aristocracy. Laws aren't made because God has appointed the lawmaker, as in divine right of kings. No, as basic as it gets in a democracy, laws are made by the consent of the governed, by their elected representatives, and we fought a revolution on the basis of that very principle. Now, if you think about what our politicians and our media say about this, I think they're certainly quite right to say that this democracy is under threat today. But it's not threatened, as the left claims, by those who actually oppose radical, economically dangerous policies and who vote accordingly. Okay, that's not what it means to be an enemy of democracy. But democracy is threatened instead by how we actually do govern ourselves today, the reality of how we govern ourselves today. And the reality is that very little government takes place by consent of the governed. very little of the decisions that our government makes are actually controlled by you or accountable to you as voters. If you think about the major policy decisions, the ones you see on the news all the time, including some of the most controversial, you'll see that they're not necessarily, in fact not usually, handed down by elected representatives, but are instead handed down by courts and by administrative agencies. In fact, they're often handed down in spite of the opposition of elected officials and in defiance of laws already enacted by elected officials. And so this threat to democracy today, which has been building for many, many decades now, is that we are ruled principally by judicial, executive, and bureaucratic decree, instead of by actual law, enacted by legislators for whom we vote. And the examples of this are everywhere. In a case that was just decided earlier this summer, the Supreme Court had to overturn the president's decree that the federal government would forgive some student loan debt, right? Which is to say, it's going to take the debt freely undertaken by some individuals and transfer it to you, your children, and your grandchildren. Right? You are going to pay that. Now, leaving aside just for a moment the dubious merits of that policy, it's something that even Nancy Pelosi, just prior to the president announcing it, explained that the president actually had no lawful authority to do. I will quote her. You didn't think you were going to get a quote from Nancy Pelosi at the Hillsdale event. Quote her. Quote, "People think that the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He does not have that power. That has to be an act of Congress." Right? That's what she said. And of course, she said that quite correctly. Right? Our policies in a democracy are made by law. Law requires the consent of elected legislators. Isn't it odd that when Mrs. Pelosi and her fellow progressives bring up threats to our democracy, which they do all the time, lawless debt forgiveness isn't one of the examples that is mentioned. Immigration policy has followed a similar pattern. And this, of course, is a contentious issue in this country. I think there are actually legitimate arguments on different sides of it. In other words, it's the kind of question in a democracy that's supposed to be resolved by law, right? People have different views, they elect representatives, those representatives deliberate with one another, and then you have a vote, right? And somebody wins and somebody loses, right? That's how that's supposed to work. Even President Obama, another person you would not expect to hear quoted in remarks here, made this fact perfectly clear when he said in 2010 to advocates of immigration amnesty the following, quote, "I am not a king. I can't do these things just by myself. With respect to the notion that I can just suspend deportations through executive order, that's just not the case. I can't just bypass Congress and change the immigration law myself. That's not how a democracy works." Pretty good. Pretty good. Now, President Obama violated that just a year later when he issued the very immigration decree that he had just previously declared himself to be illegal and undemocratic. Okay, so these are, we could go on with other examples. They're pretty clear. There's been alarm raised about them. But if you think about it, the impulse to go around or to go even contrary to our democratic system can be very powerful in certain kinds of circumstances. And this is when the situation can be taken advantage of by politicians. This is particularly true on issues of public health. And we've all just lived through numerous examples of this in recent years with the regime of rule that we had during the COVID pandemic. I mean, most of us, for months or even years, have been governed not by our elected representatives under law, but by executive or bureaucratic decree of agency officials under suspension of the law. That's certainly been how we have been governed here in Michigan for some time. And the powers that were claimed by these undemocratic rulers were far more extensive, far more intrusive than anything an elected legislator would ever dream of doing. Right? Placing citizens under some version of house arrest, restricting the most basic rights of worship, of association, of expression, all done by decree. My personal favorite of these anti-democratic decrees, I'm sure you all have yours, was the moratorium on evictions. Anybody remember that one? If like me, you happen to depend on rental income for some of your living, I bet you do remember that. Where we had by decree a policy that went on for 2 years, requiring landlords to bear the housing expenses of their tenants, setting up a system basically of squatters' rights on private property. My tenants were foolish enough to keep paying their rent. Thanks be to God. But you know, remember, this didn't come from a law, right? Or at least not the many extensions of it. It was decreed by the CDC. In fact, in direct defiance of votes taken by your elected representatives. They went to the legislature to get this thing extended, and the legislature, the people you actually vote for, refused to do it. And so the agency came in and did it instead. Not a word of complaint about that from those wringing their hands about the fate of our democracy. So these examples all have one thing in common. They were imposed by bureaucratic decree precisely because elected legislators would not enact them into law. This was openly stated in all of these cases. The legislature won't do what it's supposed to do, and so I will do it instead, or the bureaucracy will do it instead. But as I hope is obvious, that's not actually democracy. Right? It's astounding to have to say that, right? To have to explain that. I know not in this room I don't have to. Right? In fact, what is democracy is if you have a legislature that declines to enact a law because doing so is unpopular with its constituents. That actually is democracy. But that is precisely what's painted as the threat to our democratic system today. And the policies are enacted in defiance of ordinary democratic measures precisely because they stand no chance of winning legislative approval. Think of for example, think of the decree from the Obama Department of Education in 2016, which allowed transgendered students access to whichever bathroom they please in a public school. And this was simply made up out of whole cloth, without legislative warrant, okay? The reason for that being so is simple. If they'd taken a vote on this in Congress, first of all, it never would have been proposed. But you have legislators there who actually have to answer to voters. How many votes are you going to get for forcing your third grade daughter or granddaughter to share a bathroom with an older boy? And so the agencies have to do it instead, because the democratic process won't yield the preferred result. Right? So democracy is not the goal of these people. It's an obstacle to what they want to do. It's an obstacle to their agenda. Now, unfortunately, this ability for politicians, for bureaucrats to rule by a decree has been, it didn't just appear with COVID. It's been in the making for a long time, many decades, going well back into the 20th century. And all too often, this has been because Congress has been very happy to punt its duty to make law over into the executive and over into the bureaucracy. And there have been at least a couple of reasons for Congress thinking this way. First of all, think of the original Progressive era, the New Deal. what came out of that was the scope of government grew very, very substantially in the first half of the 20th century. And Congress simply did not have the time, did not have the wherewithal to make specific laws in all of the areas into which the federal government was now involving itself. And so it created a large administrative apparatus to handle the details. And what it would do is it would enact vague, kind of general statutes into law. These statutes would give broad authority to bureaucratic agencies to make the specific rules and regulations. And most major policy areas are now governed by this kind of statute. So Congress, we say Congress has delegated its lawmaking power to the agencies, but the point is people in the agencies aren't accountable to you, like members of Congress are. And the other reason this has happened over time is that Congress also long ago figured out how advantageous this can be for its own electoral self-interest. Right? Remember, members of Congress seek nothing more than the perpetuation of their own offices and privileges. And our big political issues tend to be divisive. Lots of people on both sides of them, right? And so voting for them is a dangerous thing for somebody who wants to keep his job, right? Because no matter what you do, 50% of the people are going to hate your guts. And that's not a good recipe for easy re-election. Wouldn't it be better to punt those divisive questions over into the bureaucracy, let people make those decisions who don't have to face voters, and then maybe just for entertainment, you can drag those very same people before your congressional committee and berate them in front of the television cameras. And so members of Congress instead, they like to gain credit for, really from all sides, for enacting these vague platitudes into law. Affordable health care for all, clean air. Who's against that, right? That's the thing you want people to vote on the basis of those sort of vague, meaningless, mindless slogans. And when it comes to the actual legislating, to all of the hard choices that have to be made in order to achieve some of these policy goals, that's hard to do. Voters might get mad at you. We don't want to do that. And so we're left with a situation today where we really have become all too accustomed to feeling the effects of rules made by people other than those whom we elect and whom we can hold to account. And one begins to wonder and one begins to fear that we have lost the power to affect the course of our country through elections. And that's a crisis point for a democratic regime. It's a threat that courts have allowed for a long time, in fact. And it's really been that legal environment has really been a perfect storm in recent years as so often the democratic branches have been relying on these agencies to make these very sweeping and impactful rules and laws. Right? They're relying on the agencies to an unprecedented degree to make policy decisions, controversial policy decisions that in a democracy are supposed to be made by people for whom we vote. So there's a silver lining here. Which I have to say, because this may surprise you, I have a tendency to depress people. This is not, so it's not desirable. There is a silver lining, especially I think going on in the courts today. I think there's some reconsideration of this, especially at the Supreme Court level. Just last year, I think this is the biggest piece of evidence for this silver lining. Lost in all the attention that was given to the big court decisions on abortion and on guns, you had a pretty big smackdown on the power of bureaucratic agencies. And it's one that if you want to understand why you see all these attacks today, especially on the Supreme Court, it's probably more to do with this than it is with the hot button social issues. Because this is the thing that really threatens the power structure in Washington. The case was called West Virginia v. EPA. And the EPA, of course, is another example that I could have mentioned of an agency that makes policy all the time without democratic warrant, without the benefit of actual law having been enacted authorizing it to do so. And to understand the significance of this, you first have to understand, with regard to the EPA and all of the regulations that it makes on global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, Congress has never actually given the EPA legislative authority to regulate global warming. Never. I mean, the last major environmental law in this country was enacted in the 1970s. It's a long time ago. And that law, the Clean Air Act, by the way, does anyone know, does anyone remember maybe what it was enacted to deal with, what it does empower the EPA to deal with? Acid rain. Anyone remember acid rain? Okay, that's the Clean Air Act. That's the Clean Air Act. These days, the EPA has been relying on a very, very broad reading of this very old law in claiming the power to regulate global warming. And the court for a long time went along with this, but lately not so much. And what the court said in the West Virginia case was that in order for the bureaucracy to make rules and regulations, Congress must first vote and enact a law giving it the power to do that, because after all, this is a democracy. Right? Now you might say, well, yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. But to those of us who follow this kind of thing, it was an astonishing decision, because this is simply not the way the courts have operated. It's not the way the agencies have operated for decades now. And so that's good news. And it may be, I think, a sign of a larger movement. It's why the establishment is freaking out over the courts. It's why you hear all the the alleged scandals and so on, which are a bunch of baloney. It's because this is a threat to the way Washington works. So that's the hope. I'm going to wind up by thinking about what else the future might hold for democracy. And in many of these other ways, it is hard to be optimistic. There is great cause for concern. We have troubling signs. It's now routine in our social media for speech that isn't favored by the government to be banned, to be labeled disinformation and disallowed. The evidence of this and how prevalent this has been over the last few years is now coming out. We have the increasing use of federal law enforcement as agents of the party in power. We have the depiction of the half of the country that didn't vote for the current regime as enemies of the state. Okay, these are not promising signs. In fact, while our 18-year-old sons and daughters, while they aren't old enough to have any memory of how these kinds of things have been the hallmark of totalitarian regimes going back into the 20th century, many of us in this room grew up with it, didn't we? We recognize it for what it is. It's why I think the education at the college, at Hillsdale, is particularly important at this moment. Because it's true that our students may come in with no memory or no knowledge of the more tyrannical decades that many of us lived through in the 20th century. But they won't leave that way. Okay? They're not going to leave that way, and I don't think that that's something you can say about too many other institutions in higher education these days. They also won't leave without a basic understanding of the realities of economics, such as, for instance, when you print more money to throw at interests, this is going to create inflation. This is, of course, what happened to healthcare in the 1960s, and it's also exactly what happened to the price of higher education in this country. Let's think about that example from earlier, the idea of forgiving student loans by administrative decree. Right now, this is a bad policy in so many obvious ways. But we all know higher education is just ridiculously expensive, right? People spend their life savings and then some on it. When did this become necessary in this country? When did universities begin to bloat their budgets? Mostly by way of administrative largesse, by the way. When did this happen, and when did thus their prices skyrocket? Well, at the exact moment the federal government came in the 1960s, and decided to subsidize higher education. That's when you got the hyperinflation in education. That's when you got the hyperinflation in healthcare. Same exact moment. The people running these universities aren't stupid. Many may be evil, but they're not stupid. Right? If you swell people's ability to pay for a product or service, the price of that service is going to go up. Right? And in the case of higher education, it has, big time. And that's exactly what's going to happen again, even more so, if the left succeeds in getting these various schemes for debt forgiveness enacted. And I should say that's what's going to happen, except at one place. Okay, because our tuition at Hillsdale for a highly competitive private college, it's actually pretty darn reasonable. And why is that? Because it's actually real money for us. It's not government funny money. We refuse the federal and state subsidies. This doesn't mean that we don't take students of modest means. We do all the time. But except for us, the money that's required to do that is real money freely given by people who support what we do. Right? It's not simply printed by the government. It's not taken in the form of taxation, or for the most part piled on all of our children and grandchildren in the form of public debt. That's the difference. So that's why we get out here, not just here, but all over the country. And we do events like this, and we speak to crowds like this. I hope in that vein you've learned a little bit more about the college, about what we do, why many of us believe that it's essential, that it plays an important role in preserving our country today. And with that, I'll cease and desist, and maybe take questions if they'll let me take questions. Yes, okay, great.